Hello, and welcome to SBTi's training for financial institutions. This session covers Module 3, Science-Based Targets Overview. In this module, we'll be giving you an overview of science-based targets. At this point, you should be familiar with the importance of setting goals to reduce carbon emissions and what other organizations, including SBTi, are doing in the financial services sector to reduce their carbon footprint. After completing this module, you will be able to articulate how SBTs address climate and help business, explain how emissions reduction targets are set, know where to access relevant tools and stakeholders to set targets. Let's get started. To start, what is a science-based target? Science-based targets are goals that leverage the latest climate research to help companies and organizations align their corporate actions and measure progress as they move towards reducing their net carbon emissions. Ultimately, the goal is to reduce emissions towards net zero. This is in line with the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. Science-based targets are unique because they demonstrate a real commitment on the part of the company to taking action against climate change. Because they are backed by science, they hold more credibility than other targets might. By anticipating regulatory change and factoring in the climate risk, they help to enhance the resilience and competitiveness of the businesses that set them. Ideally, these science-based targets are validated by a third-party organization like SBTi. As noted, ideally these science-based targets are validated by a third-party organization like Science Based Targets Initiative, which is a coalition of the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, the UN Global Compact, and the World Resources Institute, WRI. Founded in 2015, SBTi launched and codified sector decarbonization principles for 13 key industries. In 2018, SBTi announced a multi-year project aimed to codify guidance for financial institutions specific to decarbonizing investment portfolios. What started in 2018 was a 2+ year public consultation process that involved several stakeholder interviews, webinar series, and road testing with participants. The first draft of the guidance and tool did not emerge until August of 2020. The guidance will continue to evolve today. SBTi has over 3,400 participating organizations to date and aims to be a centralized standard of emissions target setting. What makes SBTi so unique? There are 4 key aspects. Firstly, it provides independent third-party assessment. Other organizations encourage companies to set targets or to engage the real economy, but SBTi is the only one that provides third-party assessment. Second, it enables comparability and standardization within the industry. When organizations can set any targets, picking and choosing what to include and how to measure it, they are not comparable. It makes it difficult for a company or any stakeholder to compare one company relative to one another, even within an industry. SBTi leverages strong recognition and usage in the real economy as well. There are other industry alliances that encourage target setting, but none have the influence like SBTi does in galvanizing the real economy to action, which is exactly what financial institutions are being called to do. And finally, SBTi catalyzes change this decade by differentiating between near-term and net zero targets, which are longer term. If the world needs to have emissions by 2030 in the next 8 years, then near-term actions must be incentivized, not only an ambition for 2050. In summary, SBTi holds a very unique role and offers a unique platform for financial institutions to engage in. A common question revolves around what are the similarities and differences between SBTi and GFANZ. The main takeaway is that there are complementary aspects, but SBTi is the only one that currently provides third-party standards and verification of targets. As we previously discussed, SBTi is a coalition that defines, promotes, and validates science-based targets that are verified by a third party. 1, it spans most industries, with specifics also on financial institutions. It's civil society led. It's focused on targets with a prescriptive standards approach. And finally, it enables financial institutions to set third-party verifiable ambitions. GFANZ is an industry coalition in partnership with the UN Race to Net Zero to drive change across the financial sector. It is specific to financial institutions only. It's industry-led with a UN partner. It offers a broad vision for how to execute with recommended but not required methods. And it enables FIs to signal or self-determine ambitions. However, it's important to remember that certain alliances, for example, like the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, are moving to more specific requirements. As you heard in the previous modules, climate change is a pressing issue. Financial institutions can play a key role in helping to achieve a Paris-aligned future. Engagement is key. Financial institutions connect and work with many companies around the world on their most ambitious projects. They have the opportunity to influence and engage other organizations to find ways to reduce carbon emissions. In dialogue with your clients and partners, you can advocate for, invest in, and steer towards business practices that ultimately reduce carbon emissions. SBTi has a 5-step process for guiding corporates and financial institutions through setting targets. The first step is to send in a letter of commitment. Upon doing so, FIs will have up to 24 months to submit targets to SBTi for consideration. Upon committing, FIs will take many months to develop their targets. This is a challenging part of the process and the focus of most of these training modules, particularly modules 4 through 7. The third step after development is submit, where companies will engage in a validation process with SBTi. And then they'll complete steps 4 and 5, which are to communicate and disclose once it's approved. Modules 8 and 9 will overview this. Financial institutions must consider many aspects when they're decarbonizing. SBTi helps point companies on the right path by helping them set meaningful science-based targets. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, outlines a helpful transition plan framework that highlights essential components. The first is setting your objectives through foundations. The next is implementation of strategy. So what products, services, and more will change? An engagement strategy needs to be in place. How will engaging with stakeholders evolve? Metrics and targets. This is where SBTi helps take a framework for change and turns it into a credible, verifiable action in pursuit of the transformation of change. And finally, governance, which is to help ensure the change and results are achieved, which you'll need to be thinking about even as you're setting targets, as this can develop targets that you can measure within the boundaries of your organizational capabilities. We'll review this in Module 9. When starting to set your targets, it's important to understand the 3 scopes within which emissions are counted. Scope 1. Scope are distinguished by direct and indirect consumption. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from assets that a company owns and operates. Most often for financial institutions, this would be company-owned cars or jets, for example. Next are indirect emissions. Scope 2 emissions are emissions that result from the generation of energy purchased by a company. This could be electricity to power branches or electricity supplied to office buildings. Scope 3 is the other category for indirect emissions. These are emissions that result from the activities that occur in other parts of a company's value chain. There are a wide array of activities from business travel to emissions from financing activities. To help account for Scope 3, it is divided into operational and finance activities. There are 15 different categories for Scope 3 emissions. We will focus most of our time on category 15, which you can see on the right-hand side. These are emissions from investments. Financed emissions. Financed emissions take into account the emissions from the companies that a financial institution is invested in, loaning to, or underwriting. Here's an example of an industrials company. On the very far right, you'll see the scope breakdown of emissions from an illustrative global financial services provider. For many financial institutions, their largest contributor to emissions are Scope 3 financed emissions. which you see in the bright blue bar. This results from their investments. That's why SBTi focuses on ensuring targets are set against not just Scope 1 and 2, but also Scope 3 financed emissions. Determining what are direct versus indirect emissions and what is Scope 1, 2, and 3 depends on your organizational and operational boundaries, which we'll discuss in Module 4. When setting your targets, keep in mind that they will need to cover emissions from the entire business. This means if you are a large organization, you can set targets at the level of the primary entity, which you can see on the left-hand side. However, you can also set targets for legally owned subsidiaries. These must be full legal entities, not just business lines. You can see this in the middle. On the far right, you can see an example of what you shouldn't do. You should not set targets for a single line of business or just part of an organization. For example, you should not have a separate ESG advisory service and set targets only for that ESG service. Doing so would lose out on the benefits of being comprehensive. So why be comprehensive? Setting organization-wide targets ensures that your targets lead to impactful emissions reductions. By setting meaningful targets, it also helps companies to get ahead of where regulation and other demands will be so that you're ahead of the curve. And finally, setting comprehensive targets drives change throughout the business, not just one division or portfolio, and it provides a North Star around which to rally. While one could set near-term and long-term targets, SBTi is primarily focused on near-term targets in order to catalyze reductions in this decade. Near-term targets are the primary focus for SBTi as they help to focus more immediate action. These targets are required and fall in the 5 to 15-year range from the submission date. While not required, SBTi encourages setting longer-term targets of more than 15 years from the submission date. These help to focus efforts towards a longer term and allows for continued ambitions of reducing carbon emissions. Note that there is slightly differing language around net zero and limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Net zero is a goal around neutralization of emissions with minimal reliance on offsets. It is believed that if we can achieve net zero emissions by 2030, that the global warming can be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius or well below 2, which is needed to avert the most catastrophic effects of climate change. SBTi is currently developing its first global net zero standard for financial institutions. It is currently out for public comment and will be published in 2023. To develop targets, you'll want to follow 3 steps. First is setting the organizational and operational boundaries. This will help determine how to classify scopes and what operations will need targets. Second is calculating the baseline. You want to know what your current emissions are today so you can know how to set your target, and that directs you to where you want to be in the future. The final step on the far right is calculating the target. Most firms find the first 2 steps, setting boundaries and calculating the baseline, to be the most challenging and time-consuming. Once you've done the upfront work required to do steps 1 and 2, 3 will likely be easier. As you begin the process to set the right targets, you'll want to prepare to answer a few key strategic questions. Will the targets you set apply to the whole firm, subsidiaries, or a combination? This will be important in how you message both internally and externally. It will also affect the amount of effort required to achieve your goals and the number of stakeholders you need to involve. Approach and asset class. Next, a very important and challenging consideration: how will you account for your reduction? And what categories and asset classes to choose? While this may appear simple at first, accounting for greenhouse gas emissions is not easy, and depending on the data your company currently has, it may be challenging to start. It also may require investment and resources to start accounting for GHG emissions. In addition, the asset classes and approach may impact the growth or business model of your organization. Number of targets. There are a number of targets that you can set, both within a scope, for different categories, and for different asset classes. There's also different types of targets. As you begin to consider the targets you'll set, you'll want to think about what you can control or influence and what data you have access to or your customers can provide. Near-term horizon. Setting your near-term targets will require thinking about how much disruption your organization can handle and how much upfront investment your organization can afford. Long-term horizon. While not required, it's still important to think about how long-term and what goals your organization has, and if you can achieve net zero sooner than 2015. This can be a point of differentiation and is important to think about as you develop your targets. We've designed these training materials to address many of the considerations on this page. While this may seem like a lot to do, SBTi has a number of resources available to help you with setting targets. The guidance is the overarching set of materials, which includes an overview of the criteria, recommendations, and methods. Additionally, SBTi has a set of tools to calculate all scopes. You can access the tools and resources via SBTi's website. SBTi is updating resourcing on a regular basis and will ensure that is fully public. So please be sure to always check the financial institution's webpage for the latest. Setting targets requires collaboration from across the organization as well. We provide an illustrative example to show how this works, but please recognize that there are other models for ways of working. First, there's an announcement of intent. It starts with the CEO or the board committing to set targets. They will then task a chief sustainability officer or equivalent to lead the process with the involvement of key parties. The sustainability manager will work across business lines with many different stakeholders to baseline emissions and then determine what are the achievable and reasonable targets to set. This is an iterative process and can take time to complete, but it is necessary to setting meaningful targets. Guidance from professional organizations and consultants can be helpful in navigating this process. Once the sustainability manager has created the first set of targets, they will present them to the board or the CSO to decide. The business will then ensure they are aligned with the path forward. Setting targets can feel daunting, and companies experience a number of common challenges at the start. We highlight and answer 5 common ones here. First, the SBTi guidance keeps changing. The SBTi guidance evolves as science and best practices evolve. It gets updated at most on an annual cycle. To help mitigate the effects on businesses, previous baselines and targets are considered grandfathered in, and previous methods are allowed to be used for up to 6 months after SBTi updates guidance. However, if targets require recalculation, they will have to follow the most recent applicable criteria at the time of resubmission. The next common challenge we hear is we want to start setting targets for a subset of our portfolio. SBTi requires that targets be institution-wide and cover the full portfolio with a few exceptions for asset classes in Scope 3, Category 15. While coverage implies everything is in scope, there are still years to accomplish full coverage. This is done to ensure companies drive meaningful change. Our data quality is terrible. This is a known issue, but should not stop companies from engaging in setting targets. The PCAF accounting standards have data quality scoring. This scoring allows FIs to develop a strategy to improve data quality over time, and therefore targets are updated and achieved over time as the data gets better. This is all part of the process of FIs engaging clients in the broader ecosystem to get better data over time. Our portfolio churns fairly quickly. While SBTi is continuing to evolve their guidance for financial institutions, there are a few ways to address this. First, rebaselining is required at a minimum every 5 years or for significant portfolio change. PCAF, GFANZ, GHGP, and SBTi are all aligned that companies should develop their own policy for what significance means. This policy should include the quantitative and qualitative triggers for rebaselining. What will be significant will vary based on the nature of your portfolio and business. Rebaselining policies are typical for structural change like mergers and acquisitions, significant organic growth, or decline. It's not considered grounds for rebaselining. Further guidance is being developed based on the experience of companies implementing these policies. And finally, we feel incentivized to divest versus engage. We hear the concern that companies feel encouraged to divest rather than engage and to try to transform companies. Committing to targets is about setting ambition. Decarbonization is achieved over time. It's not a day one expectation. The pathways should support high emitting companies' decarbonization, but this is a process, not a mandate to divest. FIs should disclose annually their investments in financing and lending to fossil fuel companies. Despite the challenge, the benefit is worth it by being recognized for international leadership, demonstrating that positive change is possible, and helping to build long-term sustainable business models. You can see a number of entities that have set science-based targets within the financial services space. Concluding this module, you should leave with a few key takeaways. A science-based target aligns commitments with the Paris Agreement's goals. SBTi is the only third-party validator of science-based targets, which provides a 5-step process and numerous tools for accomplishing it. And companies should set near-term targets that cover at least scope 1, 2, and 3 financed emissions across the full legal entity. Thank you for listening to this module.